He's speaking.
Okay, well, we will get started here. I want to post here at the outset our upcoming events. Hello, everyone. To make it official, my name's Dan Inkster. I am the director of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership at the University of Houston. We sponsor these events. We have a couple of care forums coming up. One on March 10th with Lina Maria Murillo, and then on April 28th with Helena Hirata. So I don't have titles for those yet, but I will send out information about those. I am one of the members of the advisory board for this care forum. The others are Joan Tronto, who I see there, and Asha Bandari and Lina Murillo. I'm not sure if she's here or not. I can't see everyone. Anyway, I'll send out an announcement next week about Lina's event on March 10th, but be looking at that for that, please. Okay. So for today, we are very lucky to have with us Professor James Thompson. He's a professor of applied and social theater at the University of Manchester. He's joining us. I was talking to him before most of you arrived at 6 p.m. where he is. There's a birthday party for you. You said your mother? Or
my mother-in-law, actually.
Your mother-in-law going on downstairs. So he is very generously giving his time on this Friday evening for him to be with us. So thank you very much for doing that. Professor Thompson has written widely on applied theater, socially engaged arts and theater in conflict and humanitarian disaster contexts. His books include Performance Affects, Humanitarian Performance, and Care Aesthetics. Today, he'll be talking about his article, Toward an Aesthetics of Care, and his book, Performing Care, and some of the work he does at the University of Manchester on performance and care. Professor Thompson will talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. If you have a question, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a reactions. You can click on that, and then you can raise your hand. If that doesn't work for you, you can just type into the chat if you have a question, or flail your arms around until somebody notices you and says that there seems to be a question about. So, one way or another, this is a pretty, informal affair. The important thing is if you do have a question of any sort or a comment, right? We tend to be pretty open as well. You don't have to have a specific question formulated. If you just kind of want to throw out some impressionistic thoughts, we welcome that as well. So with that, let me again thank Professor Thompson for being with us. Let me thank all of you for joining us, taking time out of your day to be with us, and I will hand the floor over to you.
So thank you very much, Dan, and thank you to everyone in the Ethics Centre for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here. As Dan said, I'm going to talk mostly this afternoon about my work on the relationship between care and aesthetics. But I will come to that in a second. I want to give a little bit of background about how I became interested in this area. I will talk about sort of the origins of my interest in care and the arts. Then I'm going to look a little bit at the arguments in my book, which Care Aesthetics came out last year. And then I want to give a brief outline of a research project that I'm currently working on. As Dan said, I'm a professor here at the University of Manchester. My work is in what's called applied theatre. That's broadly theatre not in theatres, or theatre in communities, or theatre with different populations who would traditionally not be involved in the theatre. I spent actually the first 10 years of my professional practice working in prisons, developing arts programs in prisons, both here in the UK, but also in Brazil. And then the sort of next 15 years of my work, really from the year 2000, I was developing and supporting arts programs in war and conflict zones. Particularly, I was documenting the work of artists who lived and worked in contemporary war zones. But also I was developing programs of art programs in those contexts. One of the last projects I was involved in really was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I was working with community theatre makers and local activists looking at women's and girls' rights, particularly in the context of girls' access to education. And I was working with Congolese artists who were creating theatre and performance pieces that toured communities in the eastern part of the Congo, an area that had been really particularly badly affected by the civil war in that country. For anyone who's encountered the article, which was called Towards an Aesthetics of Care, will know that this was the sort of turning point in my work and was the stimulus to my interest in the relationships between care and the arts. Very sadly, that project ended in a massacre with 7 of our colleagues on the project being killed. And one of my colleagues, who was the drama worker on the project, was injured in that incident. And by a really complicated route, ended up living with my family here in Manchester. He had a bullet wound in his arm, and he came to Manchester for an operation on his arm and post-operative recuperation. And in that period, I had the privilege of being very closely involved in his care, but also a witness to the care that he received from his physiotherapist. And I saw the intense relationship and the intense practices of care that relationship involved over a long period of time. What happened is that sort of simultaneously, both myself and my wife referred to this practice as beautiful in our discussions of it. And I became intrigued about why we had chosen that word. Why had I chosen a word that more usually comes from the arts or from aesthetics to describe a practice of care? And that led me to start sort of trying to work out what might be the relationship between beauty and care and whether that relationship held any water. To follow up that hunch, I encountered the helped me navigate the hunch that there was something of care. Prior to this work, prior to sort of moving into the uninteresting care, because I was working in war zones and working in places of humanitarian disaster, the register for my work and register for my writing had been very much in notions of loss, injustice, cruelty, suffering, important registers for that work. But I then became, seeing the care work of my colleague Antoine, I became interested in thinking about what other registers for this sort of work might be possible, and particularly registers for work that were involved around human capacity rather than loss. One of the inspirations for this is the work of Bell Hooks and her writing on love. She writes, I think, remarkably about the importance of love in the work of activists and academics. But she asked the question, why are we more able to speak about loss than love in that work? And this idea of trying to think about what might a register for love be in critical work in the humanities, in a very minor key way, started to be an inspiration for me to think about working in a register of human capacity. And for me, that was the human capacity to care for each other. As I developed this work, it led to 2 claims. The first claim that I was seeking to make is that there is an artistry, or there can be an artistry or craft in the practice of care. And the second claim was that collaborative moments of care create aesthetic experience. And I'll say a little bit more about the notion of aesthetic experience later. The importance for me is actually that this is trying to, in a way, turn what is traditionally called the arts in health movement somewhat on its head. So this is not about what the arts bring to healthcare contexts. Instead, it's about what aesthetics are already present in health and care practices. So I started to become interested in the art of healthcare rather than the arts in healthcare. As I've sort of developed my interest in the idea of care aesthetics, the research has really got a double edge for me. One edge is around what happens if artists, particularly those artists who are socially engaged or involved in the participatory arts, what happens if they take care ethics and a practice of care seriously in their rehearsals, in their gallery practices, in their dance studios, and so forth. But the second edge to this work is what happens if care as a practice takes the aesthetics of that practice, both its craft and the quality of the experience of care, seriously. And these two edges are in a way the stimulus for the book that called Care Aesthetics that came out last year. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, but it actually starts with a poem, and it's not a poem of my own. I start the book by looking at the poem of a poet from the UK and Trinidad called Roger Robinson. In 2019, Roger Robinson wrote a collection called A Portable Paradise, and it won the leading poetry prize in the UK, the T.S. Eliot Prize. It's an extraordinary collection, and I recommend it to people here. If you want an insight to the experience of the Black experience in the UK, and particularly the experience of injustice and racism in the UK, it's a remarkable collection of poetry. Now, there's one poem in Roger Robinson's collection called Grace, about a nurse. And when he reads this poem, he calls it his love letter to the UK's National Health Service and its nurses. And it's actually the story of the care for his premature son. And I want to read the final two stanzas of this poem. Two caveats to this. First, as well as he does. So I recommend you search for Roger Robinson, and there's YouTube videos of him reading this poem, which are remarkable. And also, I just want to give a content warning that this poem is about the death of a young baby. Not his baby, his son actually survived, but this is about the death of a young baby. So these are the two final stanzas. Another consultant tells the nurses to stop feeding a baby who will soon die. And she commands her loyal nurses to feed him. No baby must dead with a hungry belly. And she'd sit in the dark, rocking that well-fed baby, held to her bosom, slowly humming the melody of Happy by Pharrell. And I think, if by some chance I'm not here and my son's life should flicker, then Grace, she should be the one. Grace is a poem about care, but it's also an artwork about the art of care. In many ways, this poem frames my book. So care aesthetics as an idea is not care plus art or art in care settings. It's about the integration of care and art, so one is part of the other. Grace does not care and then add singing. Her care can only be done when there is a physical, musical, sensory practice to her care. She rocks, she hums, she cradles as part of her caring practice. So the Care Aesthetics book is in two parts. Part one explains how I'm using the word care in care aesthetics, and then aesthetics in care aesthetics. Clearly, my use of the word care is inspired by feminist care ethics. It's an important source, going back to what I said at the beginning, which starts from human capacity and not deficit. Clearly, I do not need to summarize this field for this audience, but it's important to say that I encountered the field as an artist and arts researcher. So there's a huge number of linked concerns for me. The first of these is a focus on practice, care as an activity, a doing. The second is a focus on the quality of relations and what those qualities consist of: attentiveness, attunement, reciprocity. These words are familiar to many arts practitioners. And then there's a focus on maintenance and repair, using Joan Tronto's words. And this, for me, is linked to art making and craft making practices. And fourth, there's a focus on embodied or interhuman practices. And this draws on Maurice's work. And it leads to a focus on bodily practices, such as touch, movement, rhythm. For me, this ensured that there was a conversation to be had between areas of practice. So, for example, between the touch work of a dancer and the touch work of a nurse. Aesthetics. Now, that's the other part of this part one of the book. And I've had actually many people question my choice of word here. These questions come from two different directions. One, from people saying, why use such a technical or academic word? Why couldn't I call it the art of care, for example? And the second direction is people saying, my understanding of aesthetics is flawed and care cannot possibly be understood as an aesthetic practice. Clearly, I'm happy to take questions on either of these points. But my response to the first is that once you say art of care, excuse me, you tend to focus on an individual artist. So the artful nurse, for example, rather than the quality of the experience created in the relationship between two or more people, perhaps between patient, nurse, family member, and so forth. Aesthetics is used to focus on an experience that is crafted by multiple people and not only the one designated as the carer. It's about a relationship and not the artistry of just one person. I am interested in the art of the nurse, and then the role of the person witnessing the care of others. But aesthetics is used to be descriptive of the whole experience. My answer to the second query is that aesthetics is not only a concept related to art practices, but connects to many activities of everyday life. It draws from the original Greek word aesthesis, referring to sensory experience, and it attends to our full sensory life, rather than the limited understanding of aesthetics as things we can see or contemplate. The case I'm making borrows from multiple sources. So, for example, from everyday aesthetics, pragmatist aesthetics, the work of John Dewey, Schusterman, and also work on relational aesthetics. I'm interested in the sensory, embodied, tactile, crafted relations of care, not only a visual register. And my claim is that the word aesthetics captures some of these. So the second half of my book looks at care aesthetics in relation to health and social care aesthetics and socially engaged arts, and then care aesthetics in everyday life. In the healthcare chapter, it's important that I'm looking outside the arts and those examples where you can see care aesthetics in health and social care practices, where I would argue there is already an aesthetic register, even if it's not often called that. And I want to give an example that comes from the nursing literature. And it's from a book by Peggy Chin and Maoma Kramer. And they're describing the work of a nurse in an outpatient clinic. I'm just going to quote from their description of the work of this nurse. This is quoting them. Presley works in the orthopedic clinic of a large urban hospital and uses aesthetic knowing with each young child who comes for cast removal. It is aesthetic knowing that helps him remove the cast in the least distressing way for the child. Presley understands that this child likely sees a large person approaching her leg with an electric cutter and other tools that resemble those in her father's womb. Presley might use a combination of distraction and humor, as well as careful timing, to move through the required procedure in an artful way. The expression in this quote, aesthetic knowing, comes from the nursing literature of the 1970s. It comes from a writer called Barbara Carper. But the point is that the aesthetic framing of this care exists already in nursing, and humor, distraction, timing, and careful movement are all part of it. My point, I suppose my argument, is that the attention to the aesthetics of this care makes it a better experience for the young girl. In my chapter on the arts, I look at theatre games, autobiographical performance, what's called one-to-one performance, and then also community dance. One community dancer I focus on is a woman called Rosemary Lee, who works in different communities in the UK. And she writes about what she says, what it means to dance well. And I'll give you another quote from her talking about her work in dance. So she says, "In order to dance well, and in order to rehearse well, dancers need to have a balance of acceptance of leading and following, of letting go of control, of being in control, or of being just a partner. Just to pick someone up, just to dance with someone, you've got to kind of understand how they're feeling at the moment. There's an ability to connect with people non-verbally and to be empathetic that's really attuned in a dancer, especially in the kind of dance world I am interested in." That's Rosemary Lee. My argument is that the best arts practice completes care in the doing of it. And going back to that orthopedic clinic, the best care is the most sensorily aware. Rosemary Lee says, just to pick someone up, you've got to kind of understand how they're feeling at that moment. The words of a choreographer, which of course could be the words of a healthcare worker. Care is completed in the doing of the art. In my final chapter, I look at care aesthetics in everyday life. It's a chapter that is ultimately focused on community practices of everyday care, where the edge between caretaking and art making is blurred. I would argue this was particularly evident during COVID, where in my terms, there was frequently an aesthetics of the care that people took for each other. So cooking for neighbours who were isolating, socially distanced meeting with vulnerable friends, creating arts packages for children who were being homeschooled. Each of these combined aesthetic sensibility with care priorities. Cooking that dish was not done with cursory attention to its look and taste. A quick aside on my experience during COVID is that I acted as a mentor for children with additional needs, giving their parents a respite. I took them out to local parks when COVID rules allowed. Originally, I thought this was different from my day job, which was at that time researching care and care aesthetics. But I soon realized that it was both care work and had a certain aesthetic, in that it included play, narrative, movement, and an elementary craft. My argument is that in all these practices, that by attending to the sensory, to the aesthetic, it makes them more nourishing and more able to repair and maintain social relations. And this was particularly important during COVID when they were so fragile. One focus of the final chapter is what future care aesthetics might be. And this links to a research project that I'm leading here in the University of Manchester. We're running a series of studies focused primarily on care aesthetics in the context of older people care, particularly in the context of dementia. It explores what might a focus on care aesthetics reveal about interactions with elders, and what does attention to sensory ways of interacting teach us about care practices. In the project, we'll work in 2 secure, that's locked dementia wards, 1 care home, and then with care home worker co-researchers who work in domestic situations. The key objective is how a focus on care aesthetics on the aesthetics of care might shine a light on the practice of people whose work, certainly in the UK, is underpaid and undervalued. The project acknowledges the huge inequities in care, its poor distribution, the reliance on women, migrant women, and people of colour in its execution, but it argues that noting the aesthetics of care and where it might be extraordinary gives value to a practice that is too often invisible. I was recently shown the sequence of moves that a care worker co-researcher on the project uses to move her clients' immobile legs. And the quality of touch, the rhythm and fluency of the move, and the grace with which it was executed reminded me of the importance of focusing on the quality of this practice and, returning to the words of bell hooks, seeking out a language that can adequately speak of love, rather than only working in the register of loss. Of course, this takes me back to the Roger Robinson poem, Grace, and reminds us that the work of nurses like her need to be acknowledged for their profound artistry and resistant qualities. Grace did not do what the consultant asked her to. She rocked and sang to that baby in spite of the demand to do the opposite. Care might be undervalued, but at times it has a certain grace and it can be impressively disobedient. This also connects to the ambition for the current research project to set up what we're calling the Care Lab, or a Care Lab, which is a space where care practices can be shared and learnt from, where we can provide a platform for the work of carers like Grace, so that it can inspire others, both carers and artists alike. We're planning events, workshops, and seminars where carers and people with lived experience of being cared for, artists and others, meet and expand our understandings of the aesthetics of care, with an ambition to continue to learn from each other. We're interested in sharing knowledge of how caring relations can be practiced in ways that acknowledge their artistry and continue to develop their life-enhancing qualities, perhaps in spite of a world that is trying to tell us to do exactly the opposite. And I'd obviously welcome members of this network to attend and to contribute. So thank you for listening. And of course, I'm happy to take comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk, very, very engaging, beautifully done as well. I was entranced. So let's go to questions right away. It looks like Anderson, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. I want to say quickly, so I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of South Carolina in the philosophy department, and I'm doing work on pragmatist care aesthetics, actually. And so your talk was like extremely similar to some of the questions that I'm working with, and your work has been really helpful in developing my own ideas. And my question's about the aesthetic feeling of care, right? So I'm coming at it from the Deweyan perspective, right, as an aesthetic experience. And it seems like in some of these cases of aesthetic caring, what is developed is an aesthetic sensation or experience on behalf of the cared for, right? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about if there's a normative dimension to that aesthetic feeling, right? So I'm arguing in what I'm working on now that there is this normative element in certain cases where it seems to be required in order for a caring relationship to exist, that the cared for has a sense of being cared for, right? Has this aesthetic feeling. And I wanted to hear if you had any thoughts on that normative dimension, if that's a clear question. I'm not really sure if it is.
Dan, do you want me to answer questions straight away? Yeah. Anderson, thanks for this question. It's a really good question. One important thing to say is that in research on care aesthetics, we are, one of the things is trying to talk about experience. And you're absolutely right, is most of the ways that that's been documented tends to be the experience of one person in the dyad between a carer and a cared for. And in trying to articulate care aesthetics as something intersubjective, somehow in between two people, it still becomes very difficult to articulate the notion of experience between rather than located in the body of one person. So that's just in sort of in agreement with things you're saying. It's really interesting in our current project. It's very, at our universities and in our National Health Service, it's very hard to get ethical clearance for doing work with people who are being cared for. And it's much easier to get ethical clearance for doing work with carers. So again, the problem of assessing the concept of an aesthetic experience is really difficult, both in terms of practically doing research and the question. The normative idea of that aesthetic experience sort of touches on the idea of really on some of the ideas of emotional labor, Hochschild's work on emotional labor. And a lot of the documentation of emotional labor has tended to be, it's excellent work, but it tends to have a sort of negative assumption that this is both a performed experience or somehow a debilitating experience in the person who's giving care. And I think it's really important to articulate that it's much more ambivalent, that actually people can both, the experience can be assumed to be what you should have, but also it can be actually enjoyed and welcomed by the carer. And it's problematic to always assume that it's somehow a problematic feeling, and it's also equally wrong to assume it's something that is somehow life enhancing. So I think we have to be careful with the sense that it has a normative assumed good, but I think we also have to sort of counter some of the narratives that assume that a caring experience or that sensation of caring is automatically something that is a burden. Probably not answering your question very articulately. Apologies.
Anderson, do you have a follow-up?
No, that did answer my question. If there's time, we can loop back to it. But I don't think I wanted to frame it as a burden so much as understanding. Maybe is it important in some instances that there is an aesthetic experience generated to establish a caring relationship at all? That was more like rather than a burden. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I'm obviously quite, making a normative statement that I think often it is, but I wouldn't make that. I would say that you can't insist on that, or there will be many caring relationships which are absolutely technically correct and good, in large scare quotes, without necessarily a huge sensory overload within them. But I think many caring relationships are enhanced with attention to their sensory elements.
Audrey?
Yes, thank you so much. I found this fascinating. I work on film, and I've become interested in recent years about the relationship between film and care, and particularly films that are filming healthcare professionals or engaging with care directly. And thinking about the way you talk about care aesthetics and how the aesthetics that's already embedded in the work of care workers, but also how it can be stressed. I was also thinking about what you talk about the relationship to the visual and like expanding beyond the visual. And to me, like the relationship between film and its ability, but also its constraints in engaging with this care aesthetics or the aesthetics of care, and how that actually takes place on the documentary side, which can actually really put the emphasis on and celebrate all the qualities that you've beautifully listed about the care aesthetics, and how it happens in fiction film, because I've noticed in I work in French cinema. There's been several French films in recent years that actually bring in professional care workers to I don't know, to play their parts in the film. And some of the comments by filmmakers were actually that they felt no professional actor could actually capture the aesthetics that you're talking about. And that for them, it was like, I'd rather like sacrifice the acting part and really get the authenticity, the truth of the way people move in the ER room, or the way they actually touch the patient. So I'm trying to wrap up in one question, but I wonder like if you could speak more about this relationship between the full sensory experience and how cinema can actually engage with that, because I feel like there's been really an engagement on the part of filmmakers in recent years to play into that care aesthetics, or to support it rather.
Yeah, this is really interesting, because on one level, I'm fairly critical of assumptions that aesthetics is always in the visual register. So, and sometimes when people say aesthetics, they almost have a sort of diminutive in front of it. They go, well, it's merely aesthetic. And if you do a quick Google on aesthetics and care, you get what you find is, of course, the cosmetic surgery industry. So most work on aesthetics and care is about having things done to your face and things. So there's an assumption that aesthetics is about visual improvement. And a lot of the sort of sociology of care work will often have, occasionally when it mentions aesthetics, will say things like, they dressed the elderly person merely for the aesthetics of how they were to be, they looked, not for the real care that they deserved. So the aesthetic is a visual, something poor and visual only. So part of me has this antagonism to the visual register, because it doesn't account for actually aesthetics being a full-bodied relationship in between two people. But then I absolutely agree that some of the best examples of witnessing care have come from film in recent years. I don't know if people know the film, the Anthony Hopkins film, who starred in the film The Father, about dementia. Whatever people think about the whole film, there's a scene right at the end between him and a relationship with his care worker, which has got something of the embodied relationship of two people in a moment of care. And there is something in witnessing, using film as a witness to that relationship, which I think can be quite extraordinary. I would be really interested to learn more about the French cinema, because it's not my area. We have a colleague in our department who works on dementia in film, largely on East Asian film and representations of dementia, but he's using similar sort of analysis about how you can represent embodied relationships in film forms. But thanks for the question.
Naomi?
Yes, this is absolutely fascinating. And I apologize for just having stepped out of the shower with bathrobe. I'm really struck by what seems to me, and I think you are of course getting at this, and I'm sorry I haven't previously encountered your work, connection between the aesthetic and care ethics. And that is that one of the problems with non-care focused ethical and moral theory, and unfortunately some biomedical ethical practices, is this kind of abstraction. That is, thinking that one knows in advance what's morally relevant and focusing just on those, missing the fundamentally Aristotelian point that part of what we have to learn are habits of perception. And it seems to me that one of the roles of aesthetic attentiveness but in general, but also the role of the arts in our lives, is to help us learn to perceive more, well, accurately in a sense, but
me.
subtly and interestingly, and be taken by surprise and perceiving things differently. And it seems to me that part of what's central to care ethics is that relationship and that quality of open-ended and subtly nuanced perception. And of course, that's an aesthetic issue. So I'm sort of interested in your thoughts along those lines. That is how we, the attunement of perception and the role that that plays in caring well.
I'm not. Thank you, Naomi. I'm nodding vigorously because I obviously agree with you. You know, going back to my original story about having a hunch that this relationship had a certain craft or beauty to it that I originally encountered. I didn't have to go far in the care ethics literature to find spaces where this was absolutely being talked about. From my arts researcher, arts practitioner background, the words like attentiveness or attunement are exactly and these aren't, and as you said, these aren't attitudes that you bring necessarily prior to. They aren't sort of the sort of golden rules that you bring prior to the relationship. They are the practices that materialize as you have a relationship with someone. And attentiveness and attunement, the sort of reciprocal, real closeness in a relationship with someone, has the full bodied. It has perceptions and bodily reactions. And for me, the language of aesthetics is a place where you can actually start to try and understand them. There's some very different, I mean, the attunement of a potter to their clay, and you see sculptors working with objects, is extraordinary. You know, you'll see the best artists with a sort of an attention to being with their clay. Now, the relationship between a carer and a cared for clearly is two humans. It isn't a lump, it isn't clay. But the best artists speak about the responsiveness of the clay. They speak about this being a two-way relationship. They don't see the clay as disembodied or their relationship to it in that way. And the language that I hear in careful artists really has echoes in the work of artful carers. And I think these practices are often different. I'm not saying that there's a neat line that says this is all the same sort of work, but I think the language of aesthetics provides a space where we can start to learn between these different practices with the full body, a perceiving, feeling body.
Yes, thank you. And there's also the openness to being surprised. That the openness to perceiving something, learning something that you hadn't expected, and that doesn't fit in whatever you were previously bringing. And it seems to me that openness to surprise is another connection.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a sort of creative engagement with the world. It's a sort of openness to being creatively responsive to the world. Thank you.
G.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your talk. This is very interesting, and also it's new to me too. To be honest, I'm not quite familiar with the aesthetic part of it. The way how I understand it is to understand it as like our enjoyment of the experience. With that being said, so imagine like the experiences that the caregiver and the care receiver they have, and with the enjoyment involved, I was wondering, would it be more risk or riskier for them to like be harder for them to switch the roles? So it's like the caregiver will enjoy giving or providing care practices of care acts, and then and then the care receiver will enjoy being cared about, then it sounds like we are stuck in that role or in that position to always practicing care instead of like receiving care.
I think it's not. I think enjoyment can be part of a caring relationship, but I think it's important not to only assume that there is a sense of enjoyment. I think I'm more interested in thinking about the sensory experience between two people in a practice, and that might be through touch, a physical response, audio, use of voice, rhythm, bodily movements, and being attentive to those sensations in your body as you work with another person, is I think enhances the care relationship. I don't know if it's automatic. I think some of those therefore can be fulfilling and life enhancing, but I don't necessarily think it's about enjoyment. I think assessing what that experience is like between the two people is really hard. I think it's really difficult to know in terms of the responsiveness of the person being cared for, what sort of physical sensory experience they're having. You might be able to tell immediately because they might speak and tell you. But if you're working in the current work that we're doing with people living with dementia, the way you think and work with that person is quite sort of difficult. The reason we're working with people living and working with dementia is partly because my colleagues are experts in that area, but also because it provides a place where the sensory and the embodied responsiveness is absolutely the terrain that you have to work in, because you're not immediately talking about the visual or the verbal. You're talking about bodies in response to each other. It might not be enjoyable though. Thanks for your question.
Hey, John.
Kim, why don't you read Meryl's question from the chat first?
I'm sorry, I'm just reading it. So yeah.
Here, I'll read it out to you. Thank you. Is this it? Yeah. Thank you, James, for your inspiring talk and work. I need to go to another meeting, but I wanted to ask about another interpretation of aesthetics, perception. How might your research in care labs contribute to political care ethics? So next to the experiential sensory experience, also include concerns of how perception relates to processes of inclusion, exclusion. I had to think of Sophie Bourgault's interesting article, Jacques Ranciere's Political Aesthetics in Care Ethics. I am working on this with Alistair Neymer and would love to talk about it.
Yeah, what I need to do is obviously go, speak to Meryl offline a bit, because there's quite a lot in there. Just to, absolutely. I mean, there's something more to say about the notion of perception in aesthetics, and that's a big topic. But very importantly is that I don't, when I'm using the word aesthetics and thinking about care aesthetics, it's not in any way an alternative to the political reading of care ethics or to thinking about care ethics politically. The sense for me, aesthetics is our sensory world is an important area of politics. Who has the right to have sensations and what sort of sensations and what sort of sensations and experiences are valued is part of the unequal structure of the world that we live in. So I know some of the references using the other part of her question, that care aesthetics is absolutely a commitment to a sensory world that is richer and more equal. because it's valuing the embodied work of a whole range of people who often are undervalued and invisible in their work. But I will speak to Meryl also later.
Thank you for that. Joan?
Thank you, James, for this really wonderful, rich work. It's very exciting and I found it very inspiring. So thank you very much. I want to make a couple of comments and then you can react to them or not. The first, as you were speaking today, I almost started to laugh as I started to think about all this fascination with care robots. Yeah, that's enough said, right? I mean, what you've done is given us the argument against why care robots are a good solution to the problem of the absence of care. Thank you. The second thing I want to talk about briefly is in my own work, I've been thinking more about the ways in which everything we do is measured by money or things we can count, and we have to escape from that logic. And I find the opportunity to find beauty in the world, as well as the opportunity to experience sensation more fully, are kind of a nice way to think of metrics that are outside of the usual experience of capitalism, that makes it a really powerful part of an alternative way of framing the world. And I just found that really helpful and very interesting. Thank you. The third thing I want to say is to do this takes time. It either takes the time of developing experience over time. I mean, that wasn't the first time that nurse cut a cast off a kid's leg, right? And it comes partly from the experience. Patricia Benner, I don't know if you've run into her work. She wrote about care using a Heideggerian perspective way back starting in the late 70s, early 80s. About nursing practice being kind of an embodiment of care in its deep forms. And she argued that this was something that happened as nurses became more experienced. And I think that's one part of the timepiece. And the other part of the timepiece is if you're being rushed to do the care, then you can't fully appreciate all of these aesthetic dimensions. To develop a sensory repertoire, even to be able to feel the sensations, requires that you spend time, that you not do what the consultant said and ignore this baby who's going to die anyway, because you've got other babies to care for, right? I presume that's why the consultant said, you can't do that. So that's a really serious problem. And last comment, I was just at a conference talking in Belgium, talking about the extraordinarily high rate of dropouts among nurse trainees after they go into the field and do an internship, because they realize this isn't what they signed up for. And the reason it isn't what they signed up for is they're left on their own. They're told to go do something they don't know how to do. They're not told that there are these kinds of ways of thinking and experiencing bodies they just get told, okay, you're here today, go toilet that person. And they have no idea how to do this or how to be respectful and so on and so forth. And so they say, I really care about people, but I can't do it if I'm doing this work this way. It's a real indictment of the way that we're training nurses. But it's also, it may be, I'm going to send your work to them, to the nurse instructors, as a way of explaining to them part of what it is that the students are feeling so wrong about. Because you're right, we don't really have language vocabulary to discuss these questions. And so their absence is felt, but not appreciated or understood. It may be that even that would help keep some people from quitting caring professions. So there's just so much going on. It's so rich for me. Thank you so much.
Joan, thank you ever so much for that. That's fantastic. And of course, your work really frames so much of everything that I'm talking about. So there's I feel there's a absolute strong connection to the things you're saying. It's interesting. The first time I ever talked about care years ago, I used a quote. I had this quote from a journal article which was about the creation of robot dogs for care homes, and they covered them in fur, and they sort of squeaked, and you sort of gave them to people so they could stroke them, because they had no other stroking to be done in this care. And I mean, it was this, there is an appalling, and it was a sort of scientific journal about how many strokes you could get, and it was measuring sort of stroke per something. And I mean, so I completely get your thing about care. Yeah, let's care robots, please, no. But I love what you said, particularly about that actually when you start talking in language of beauty, looking sort of from writers like bell hooks, or these other registers, actually it is, for me, one of the strongest areas, political register that we can find, because you start to define the world in terms that the way the world is currently structured really can't cope with, and it is much more difficult to count. It's much more humane in terms of the way people relate to each other. So I absolutely would agree with that. There's a secret that I sort of note in that my first article, the Aesthetics of Care article, which I note at the very end, which has become much more troubling to me since I wrote it, is that my colleague who came from the Congo, we got him over from the Congo, and it was a private hospital in Manchester. So in the UK, obviously, private hospitals are much rarer. It's nearly all state-run hospitals. But we got this private hospital who agreed to do all his orthopedic operation on his arm and all the post-operative physiotherapy for free. And it was extraordinary. It was like a charitable gift from this private hospital. And therefore, there was no time constraints on the care from his physio. So in subsequently thinking about this example, I've realized the example that triggers my interest in care aesthetics comes from this site where time was not a constraint. So it was an utterly unrealistic location. So the problem for me is that we live in a world where finding opportunity for more sensorily rich relations of care is massively constrained. And in the UK at the moment, in terms of our health service, it's so close to impossible. So you're absolutely right that the constraint of time, what time does to care practices at the moment, is often devastating, because it means that we have care workers who have 30 minutes inside a person's house. They have to wash them, dress them, feed them, bathe them, everything, and then leave the house and chat to them and be nice to them. It's like an impossible task. So time is the great constraint. But thank you for all your comments. That's just wonderful.
I have a question for you now. I want to ask, I guess I want to just think a little bit more about this relationship between care and aesthetics, and maybe if there isn't a little bit more of a distinction than you're that I'm understanding you to say, but maybe I'm just about to make the point that you're going to agree with. But I guess I think I want to ask this question in terms of like, from what perspective does a care aesthetic come from? A lot of your examples are like a third person observer or second person, somebody who's being cared for, and you notice the artistry of your caregiver, or a third person, you're in the room and you see a nurse caring for someone, and you can appreciate the aesthetics to this. And then you go on to talk about, though, you say, well, this can be nourishing in sort of a first person perspective for the caregiver. But my concern with that is, and this is maybe just my own unimaginative understanding of aesthetics, but this notion that if the caregiver is thinking about their aesthetics, then this is a diversion from the person that they're supposed to be attending to, and that there's this possibility of getting up, getting kind of caught up in the performance of your care, or the, it's almost, almost a sense in which maybe aesthetics involve some kind of some sort of patterned action or expected behavior in a way that like when you're carrying, you're just, I mean, if you're carrying well, you're just in the moment, right? You're you're winging it. You're doing, and it's sometimes it's not pretty, right? you're just, you find your kid crying and you're in your sweatpants and and you sit down with them and they have a runny nose and you hug them and right, it's this kind of thing, and there's sort of like no to reflect that moment somehow to step outside of that moment and and sort of feel yourself like I mean, you can maybe first, retrospectively, maybe I can look back and say like, hey, I'm a really good caregiver, or, prospectively, I can think about that and I can maybe nourish myself by thinking, giving my care. I mean, if I, in a sense, if I need to give it, greater meaning, give it this aesthetic meaning, but there's something like so mundane and immediate about caregiving that I guess like my question is like, does care escape aesthetics in the moment? That'd be my question.
Yeah, this is it's a great question, and first of all, the in the moment thing. There's an area of dementia studies which is looking at something called in the moment care, which is particularly because obviously people living with dementia, the sort of what's happening the next day, if you do an intervention, obviously what's happening the next day, they might not remember. So it's thinking about being present with someone living with dementia. So actually the being in the moment is actually a crucial component of a lot of care, but really specifically for people living with dementia. And I think for me, a lot of what you were describing, that in the moment, in the flow of care, has an aesthetic element to it. So aesthetic, for me, doesn't mean that moment when you look back or you reflect. So I mean, around this group here, most of us have had blood taken, and we know that to have your blood taken from your arm there's a technical piece of that work to have your blood taken, or have your blood pressure taken. But let's say blood taken, and we know that a person taking your blood will sit next to you in a certain way, will hold your arm in a certain way, will place the needle into your vein in your arm if they're taking from your arm in a certain way. Now, that is a very mundane act, and they might be expert at it, and they probably might not think about it. But I can guarantee you, around this group here, we have people who've had that done in a way that was so perfunctory, it was close on cruel, and we've had people around this group here who've had it done in such a way that it was quite extraordinarily sort of intuitive, easy, warm. So my argument is that there isn't sort of care and then you add an aesthetic. Is actually the best care has that sense of somebody knowing. Maybe they would say it intuitively about how to sit, how to hold, how to touch someone, how to look them in the eye, where to move. Now, these are all, I would argue, are some of the aesthetic qualities of well done care. And they are very mundane. You can wash someone who's soiled themselves. You can do some of the really nasty bits of care, the difficult bits of care, in a way that is attentive to their body, is respectful, holds your body in a certain way, speaks to them, holds eye contact in a certain way. So I sort of think there is an aesthetic dimension to well executed care. But so that's my first point. But the second point is just to quickly agree with you, is that one of the problems or the dynamics that I keep falling back into is that it comes from the witness's point of view. I see my mother being cared for in a way that I think that person's got my mum sorted. The way they moved, the way they looked at her, the way they held her, that was fantastic. So much of the analysis comes from the witness. And I think methodologically, we need some more work on how do you look at aesthetics from the person doing and the person receiving, and what that might be methodologically, because too much comes from me, as you rightly said, from my observed examples. So my latter half is completely agreeing with some of the problems.
Thank you. Maurice?
That's all right.
Let's let Jordan go ahead, because I always get to talk.
All right, Jordan, you get to go. You get to jump the queue.
Aha. Sorry, everyone. I'm on the phone here, so I'm trying to navigate. I have to say, and hello, it's my first time attending this this seminar series, and thank you for all of this so far. And again, Dr. Thompson, this is my first time reading your work, and while I'm reading it and hearing you talk now, I'm wondering why I haven't been reading more of your work much sooner. I'm a PhD candidate in political theory, and I've been working a lot in not just democratic theory and stuff, but also in a lot of philosophical aesthetics, especially a lot of recent stuff. In reading, I just got a chance to read this short article assigned, and it was fascinating to me in terms of how much of what you were saying here resonates with, just in the past even 5 years, not earlier, just like a lot of this kind of recent development or reworking of aesthetic value. And again, I'm speaking within kind of a more analytic grain of philosophy here. In particular, aesthetic value often comes across as something like it's based in kind of individual pleasure. When I act aesthetically, it's aesthetic largely just because it's doing something that's pleasing to me or what I think is pleasing to others. Whereas here, and I'm going to pull a line near the end of the chapter here, the article, where you actually mention aesthetic value. Yes, you say aesthetic value is located in between people in moments of collaborative creation, conjoined effort, and intimate exchange. These are new virtuosities of care that do not rely on the singular display of self-owned skill. I had to just reread that out, because I think this is precisely what I think, and I don't know if you've been tapped into this yourself, but just for me, it just kind of, it really crystallized in how a lot, there's been this recent kind of effort among philosophers anyways, to recast aesthetic value based in community, aesthetic community, and in practices that we do aesthetically, largely because it generates greater kind of diversity and possibility to kind of own our aesthetic skills. And yes, these are not just artistic, but these could be things like mowing a lawn, or more everyday acts. And so with that said, I kind of wanted to ask the question right away, but this is kind of going back on what I think Dan and I think much earlier Anderson mentioned, is speaking more normatively, this, how do we really kind of parse out this, what is ethical with care and what is aesthetic with care. And I think what you're just saying right in the last response, I think there's kind of an agency kind of concern perhaps, that is, you're saying that's, yes, is it very much when in that drawing blood example, is the person who's doing it particularly well, is that person doing it knowingly as an aesthetic kind of act, or as kind of like a caring act, and is that should be understood as more ethical, and perhaps maybe the aesthetics pulls out in another person who observes it, get the person getting the blood pulled, or someone, a student perhaps also present in the room being like, wow, that's a really, remarkable, graceful, kind of exquisite way of, drawing blood. I really want to kind of emulate that as I become a better nurse or whoever. And so again, it's my somewhat of this question here is just asking, because I'd be really curious to know if you've been thinking about, aesthetic value more in philosophical terms, and whether that has a place in your research here, and if or if you could speak a little bit more to, again, is it possible to be, in this kind of care aesthetics, is there kind of space for a more kind of normative understanding of how one is indeed kind of valuing the care work one is doing in an aesthetic way that can be distinguished in maybe a more ethical or moral way or even political way, whether that should be possible or not. It's kind of a jam-packed question. But yes, I'll stop there.
No, thanks, Jordan. Yeah, the two sort of interrelated questions. I'm intrigued by what you're saying about value, because obviously it's an area in some of the work you're talking about, it's more analytical philosophical work I'm not necessarily familiar with. I suppose I've been trying to work out how to talk about intersubjective aesthetic experience that lies between two bodies, a body and an object, multiple bodies, because I don't think it is often located in one body, but somehow it is between bodies in the experience. And and I do, as you say at the end of that article, I make that slightly grandiose claim that it's somewhere in between people. But I think, I suppose it's sort of drawing on the relational sort of impetus behind care ethics, but there is very little work in aesthetics that can actually try and hone down on what that in-between quality of the aesthetic experience is. You get some of it in the relational aesthetics work of Bourriaud, French art theorist. And the only place I'm finding it recently is actually writing in Gestalt. I don't know if anyone here is working in Gestalt therapy, but Gestalt therapy has the notion of the aesthetics of the contact. That is the contact between a body and the environment, or two bodies in the therapeutic encounter. So I'm trying to locate something of value in that meeting place. But I don't think, I haven't found it in some, I mean, if you've got some philosophical literature that helps me out with trying to work what that aesthetic is, that'd be good. I'll come back to the other normative question. I need to think more on that one. Sorry not to answer it here, but that's I'm thinking.
Thank you very much.
Maurice?
Yeah, I got a couple of questions / comments, but first I want to say something about care robots. I don't know why. I mean, I guess it's because they're more human-like, but why can't we speak more about tools of care as opposed to calling them, giving them these attributes? I don't talk about my cell phone as a care phone or anything like that, but for some reason, these tools in hospital settings get called care robots. But more practically, James, one, I have just kind of a mundane question about how this group can keep up with your big 3-year project. If there are if there's a website yet, and if not, maybe later you could share it with Dan, because he has a way to get the information out to folks. And if you could, you talked about the kinds of folks you brought together, but if you could say something about what kinds of outcomes you're hoping for at the end, and I know that's a bit open-ended because you're kind of creating it as you go. And then the second, more theoretical question is this interesting discussion we're having here. Most of the folks here are steeped in the ethical part of it, and you've introduced us to thinking deeply about the aesthetic aspect. And Joan had this, brilliant major insight in her first major work on care moral boundaries, about crossing boundaries. And I'm just wondering about, you know, some of the questions we struggle with, like, well, this is the aesthetic and this is the ethical, and you know, I'm just wondering if care theory is just really more, you know, transdisciplinary, as Kenneth Burke would say, or even postmodern, in that it doesn't, the distinctions, you know, like the distinctions aren't always so sharp, and, you know, why is this the aesthetic and why is that the ethical, you know, kind of thing. So not a greatly formed question, but you get the idea.
Thanks, Maurice. That I'll do the first two quickly. I'm really happy for people just, you know, to share my email address. I can do some sort of informally keep people in touch. So feel free to contact me about the project. We've got we've got a new website that is emerging, so it's not quite there yet. There's some basic information online, but not the sort of full website. We're creating this idea of a care lab, which is a space where we will have a physical space in an art gallery in Manchester called the Whitworth Art Gallery, but also it's also an online space where we're bringing people together, linking to your third question, from multiple different practice and theoretical backgrounds to look at, explore, and practically examine ideas of care. And we've got the early program is happening this year, and it will emerge later in the year. And that's one of the sort of objectives of the wider project, is to have a place where people can share practically practices of the aesthetics of care, I would say. And that's people who've got care experience, carers, cared for, healthcare workers, artists, and so forth. And I'd encourage people to keep an eye out on that. The project's also going to have some very familiar sort of academic outputs, because those are the things we have to do. But the real objective is more around thinking about the care lab as a collaborative space. We have 2 care worker co-researchers working in the project. We have an advisory board, which obviously Maurice is on, but we have other sort of people from very broad professional backgrounds on the advisory board. And on the project, we have people with very different disciplinary backgrounds working. So we're interested in really making an intervention into a whole range of sort of different fields, strongly connected to dementia studies at the moment, because that's a particular focus for what we're looking at. I think it's a really good point about inter-cross transdisciplinary work. And I absolutely appreciate and would basically agree with what you were saying, that we need to sort of try and push ourselves to be beyond some of the disciplinary boundaries that we come from. I feel, you know, I'm a theatre person, theatre professor by background, and I haven't done any theatre for a long time now, and I feel a bit sort of cut off from my own department. But it's really important for me, you know, for me that the decision to move in a, you know, the decision of Grace in the poem to sing to a baby, you know, is that care? Was that aesthetic? Was that a technical scientific knowledge that singing to this baby would calm it down because she understood the role of music and endorphins? I mean, there's multiple ways for understanding that moment, each of them with their own truth. And I think that's, in the sense of post-disciplinary, it's accepting and drawing a whole range of disciplinary resources to try and understand, both understand what Grace is doing, but also champion what Grace is doing, and saying we need more people in the world like Grace who have that sense of the importance for the way she cares for people, and a sense of saying no to consultants. Not all consultants are bad, and the consultant was probably actually a decent person here, but there's that sense of the resistant quality to that is really important.
Wonderfully said. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maurice.
I think we have time for one last question or comments. If anyone wants to jump in and you know, have a question or has has something to say.
All quiet.
Well, here's what I'm going to say then. So let me just ask you about this, because here's what I was expecting from your, for 3 weeks ago, before I had read your stuff, and we had lined you up, but I thought care aesthetics. Oh, okay, it's going to be this stuff. I go to performance art pieces from time to time, and there will be things about sometimes there are efforts to more or less successful, but efforts to try to get you to think about care in a different way, or have sort of intimacy, some piece about someone washing someone else's feet, or something like this, right?
Yeah.
And this isn't really part at all of your notion of care aesthetics that I see. Like, this is this idea that, say, art, or I guess this would be more specific, art can serve a purpose to get you to maybe view something, break out of your regular way of thinking and come to appreciate something, or empathize, right? Or that Richard Rorty, these old ideas of like, forget about arguments, we just need to tell sympathetic stories. And so maybe some of the like community theater stuff you're doing fits into this, in that you're basically bringing people in to empathize through the doing. But this idea of, there was a question earlier about movies, right? Movies that can stimulate, can make you, feel sympathy, or does this have any part in your thinking about care and art and aesthetics, or are you just not that interested in this dimension?
It's great. I love the idea that you had an idea of what I was going to say. That's yeah, of course. It's really, I suppose, I'm obviously speaking today to people who are involved in a care ethics forum. So I'm speaking to a certain audience here. And if I was speaking to a group of theatre practitioners or theatre academics, I might be trying to persuade them about the way that they construct their art practices and the way they work in those forms. So I am still interested in those type of theatre, visual art, music, dance, and how they can reveal and demonstrate and discuss, communicate, embody practices of care. So I still am interested in the arts in that way. But I'm actually more interested in not art's work about care, or somehow believes that it can communicate something new about care. I'm interested in when art completes care in the doing of the art. So the way someone works with a dancer, holds their body and moves their body, that there is an act of care inherent in the way that dancer is working. And I'm more interested in that than artwork about care or arts in healthcare contexts. Because if you start thinking about the practice of the art making has a care dimension, then that says that care aesthetics is a language that helps us think about rehearsal processes, treatment of actors, treatment of young kids in arts processes, which is in conversation with the way you would take the cast off of a young girl who comes to an orthopedic clinic. So I'm interested in that as a sort of cross-disciplinary conversation. I still do go and do art stuff occasionally as well, but it's absolutely about saying that this is a language for multiple practices.
All right. Well, thank you. So this is great. It's the care ethics is it's such a broad field and can be approached in so many different ways. And I feel like your talk today was, at least for me, so educational in this way of broadening me out to this, a much deeper understanding of this whole really fascinating way that you're developing care ethics. So thank you so much for taking your evening. And thank you all for attending and participating in this. And let's give James a round of applause for his excellent talk and answering the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your great questions. And we have to send James off to a birthday party. So
Yeah.
so
I'll-
wish your mother-in-law happy birthday for all of us.
Thank you very much. And Dan, thanks ever so much for hosting, and thanks everyone for the very kind comments.
Okay.
Have
All
a
right, so we'll-
fantastic weekend, everyone.
Yeah, we'll see you all.
Thank
What
you.
is that? Like March 9th or 10th? I can't even remember now, but few weeks. We'll see you all again. So till then.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.